Let's be clear-eyed about something. If you can't sit with something for more than a minute, you're not just distracted, you're undisciplined. And that lack of self-discipline will eventually undo you, not in a classroom, but in your actual life. When the job falls apart, when the relationship cracks open, when grief hits, when something doesn't resolve in 30 seconds, and there's no shortcut, and no one's coming to save you. If you've trained your mind to dodge discomfort, to avoid depth, to bail the second something feels mentally effortful, then what exactly are you going to lean on when life stops being convenient?
This isn't just about attention, it's about psychological structure. Discipline is what allows us to hold a thought long enough to understand it, to hold an emotion long enough to feel it, to hold a problem long enough to solve it. Without that, people don't just get confused, they fall apart, they flail, they overreact. They double down on certainty because they don't have the stability to sit inside the unknown. And when that becomes the default, when people can't sit with complexity, contradiction, or pain, we don't just lose clarity, we lose resilience.
That's what this episode is about. Not just the illusion of understanding, but the erosion of the internal structures that allow people to deal with life on life's terms. And what it takes to rebuild the capacity to think, to focus, and to face hard things without shutting down.
Hello and welcome to The Psychology of Us with Professor R.J. Starr, where we explore the mind's influence on life, relationships, and society. R.J. Starr is an existential psychologist, professor, and author dedicated to exploring the core challenges of human existence, how we find meaning, embrace responsibility, and navigate life's challenges. Known for a thought-provoking yet accessible approach, RJ inspires listeners to cultivate self-awareness, emotional intelligence, authenticity, and purpose. This podcast is designed for all psychology enthusiasts, practitioners, students, and anyone curious about why we think, feel, and behave the way we do. Each episode unpacks theories, explores complex questions, and offers insights that deepen understanding of the human experience. So settle in, stay curious, and discover the psychology of us.
Most of us think we know far more than we do, and often that illusion starts the moment something feels familiar. We read a paragraph, we hear a podcast, we scroll past a headline that echoes something we've seen before, and just like that, the concept enters our mental library, not deeply, not with nuance, but with just enough familiarity to give us the feeling of understanding. This is called gist-level processing. It's the brain's way of grabbing the general idea of something and moving on. We do it constantly because it works well enough for most situations. We're not designed to do deep analytical processing every time we encounter a new idea. The brain is built for efficiency, and gist-level thinking gives us a fast, frictionless sense of comprehension. We don't need to get every detail, we just need to walk away with the rough shape of the message. But that shortcut comes with a cost. Because what we retain is not the substance, it's the impression. And once we have the impression, we often act as if we have the knowledge. You can see this happen almost anywhere. Someone skims an article, not the full text, not the citations, just the opening and closing paragraphs, and suddenly they feel ready to argue about the topic. They've caught the tone, the framing, maybe a buzzword or two, and that's enough to form a position, not a shallow one, in their mind, a confident one.
The trouble is that familiarity is not the same as understanding. When something feels familiar, it feels true, it feels processed. But that's a trick of fluency, not a reflection of actual knowledge. Real understanding requires engagement. It requires slowness and discomfort and doubt. You have to wrestle with the thing, not skim it, not summarize it. Wrestle with it. The danger is that gist-level familiarity often masquerades as depth. And once it does, we stop being curious. We stop asking follow-up questions. We stop checking our own assumptions. We treat our version of the story as if it's the story. And that's where confident ignorance begins, not with bad intentions, but with cognitive shortcuts that go unchecked.
So when we feel that quick mental click, that sensation of got it, that's often the moment to pause. Not because it means we're wrong, but because it might mean we're done thinking too soon. We're living in a moment where fractured attention isn't the exception, It's the default. And most people don't even realize it's happening because the experience of distraction has become so familiar that it feels normal. But just because something feels normal doesn't mean it's harmless. Distraction, chronic, unaddressed, normalized distraction, is dismantling our ability to think clearly, to regulate emotion, and to sustain effort over time. This is exactly the kind of shortcut thinking most likely to lead us astray. It's not just that people don't dive deep, it's that they no longer believe they should have to. Everything in our digital lives is optimized for speed, stimulation, and surface. Headlines are written to provoke, not inform. Algorithms are tuned to grab attention, not expand understanding. And the result is a generation of people who feel overwhelmed, under-equipped, and oddly confident all at once. This didn't happen by accident. The modern attention span has been engineered downward, not because people are weaker or less intelligent, but because we're immersed in systems designed to fragment focus. Every scroll, every notification, every autoplay feature chips away at our ability to stay with anything that isn't immediately gratifying. And over time, that shapes more than just how we consume content. It reshapes how we think. There's a concept in psychology called cognitive load. It refers to the amount of information your working memory can hold at any given time. When cognitive load is too high, when too many inputs compete for the same limited bandwidth, the brain starts to offload, simplify, collapse things into gist. It skips steps, it takes shortcuts, and eventually, it builds habits around that kind of mental triage. Not because it's lazy, but because it's trying to survive an environment of constant input. One of the more subtle effects of this is something called the Google effect. It describes the brain's tendency to forget information that it knows it can easily access later. If you've ever read something, found it fascinating, and then couldn't recall a single detail a few hours later, that's it. Your brain didn't encode the knowledge. It outsourced it. It assumed you'd just look it up again, so why bother retaining it? Now multiply that across 1,000 headlines, 500 videos, and an endless stream of opinions. You start to realize the problem isn't just volume, it's depthlessness. People know of many things, but understand almost none of them. They mistake exposure for learning, recognition for mastery, and the pace at which they move through ideas makes true reflection almost impossible. But the real cost isn't informational, it's psychological. Because when you live in a mental ecosystem that never asks you to think deeply, you lose the ability to do it. You lose the cognitive stamina to sit with a problem, the patience to work through ambiguity, the discipline to follow a thought all the way to its end. And once that capacity weakens, so does your ability to handle anything that doesn't come with a quick answer. Life doesn't operate at the speed of a swipe. It requires presence, discernment, and endurance. If your attention is too fragmented to hold a hard idea, it's probably too fragmented to hold a hard moment. That's when people default to blame, distraction, denial, because staying with reality, especially when it's painful or complex, takes mental muscle. That's the piece most people miss. Mental resilience isn't natural, it's trained. And just like physical strength, it builds when you stop bailing the second things get heavy. And if you haven't been training that muscle, life will eventually reveal it.
One of the most dangerous things the human mind does is confuse exposure with expertise. It hears something once, recognizes it the second time, and by the third, it's ready to speak with conviction, not because it's earned that certainty, but because the repetition feels like evidence. We trust the feeling of familiarity more than we trust the reality of our own limits.
This is how false confidence forms. It doesn't come from deep study or structured reflection. It comes from repetition, from validation, from the ease of access to content that confirms what we already think. We feel informed because the language sounds familiar, because the tone matches our worldview, because the information doesn't challenge us to sit longer with our confusion. And the mind takes that fluency and quietly upgrades it to understanding. There's a well-documented cognitive phenomenon called the Dunning-Kruger effect. It shows that the less people know about a subject, the more likely they are to overestimate their competence. It's not arrogance, it's blindness. When you lack knowledge, you also lack the ability to recognize what you're missing. And that gap doesn't feel like ignorance, it feels like confidence. Ironically, people with more expertise often show less confidence because they understand the complexity. They've seen the contradictions. They've felt the weight of not knowing. And so their answers come slower. Their language includes qualifiers. Their conclusions are more cautious. But in a culture that rewards speed and certainty, they're often overlooked in favor of louder, simpler voices. But the consequences of confident ignorance aren't just cognitive, they're relational. They show up in how we parent, how we lead, and how we talk to each other. Because what starts in the mind doesn't stay there. It shapes how we move through the world. Another way this shows up is through overclaiming. In studies, people will confidently say they're familiar with concepts that don't exist. The more confident someone is, the more likely they are to claim knowledge of made-up terms. That's not just a fluke, it's a psychological defense. When we value appearing smart more than being accurate, we create habits of pretending. Pretending to know, pretending to understand, pretending to have done the work. And then there's confirmation bias, the reflexive tendency to favor information that reinforces what we already believe. Once someone thinks they understand something, they'll filter out anything that suggests otherwise. They don't revisit the topic. They don't ask better questions. They collect evidence for their conclusion, not challenges to it. The goal becomes protecting the belief, not expanding the mind. All of this gets reinforced in subtle social ways. We admire people who sound sure of themselves. We follow the person with the quick take, the polished opinion, the quotable certainty. We don't always stop to ask how they arrived there. We're drawn to confidence, even when it's built on nothing. And once confident ignorance becomes normalized, it stops being recognizable.
What makes this so difficult is that it feels good. Certainty gives us relief. It makes the world feel manageable. But when that certainty isn't built on actual understanding, it becomes brittle. It can't hold weight. And when the pressure comes, when a problem gets more complex, when a perspective gets challenged, when a life event forces real decisions, shallow certainty cracks fast. It has no structure underneath it, just speed, tone, and performance. That's what false knowing does. It gives people the illusion that they're grounded when they're actually standing on scaffolding made of familiarity and speed, just enough to feel solid until pressure hits. And the higher the confidence, the harder the fall when reality finally shows up. The real danger of false certainty isn't just intellectual, it's existential. It starts with how we think, but it ends with how we live. Because when someone builds their inner world around what they think they know, they stop making space for revision. They stop listening. They stop growing. And that rigidity begins to show up in the places that matter most, in their relationships, their leadership, their capacity to hold tension without collapsing. False knowing feels like strength, but it's actually emotional fragility wearing confidence like armor. You see it in conversations that aren't really conversations anymore. Two people talk past each other, both certain, both unyielding, both rehearsing opinions they've repeated 100 times. Neither one is curious. Neither one is building. They're just asserting. That's what false knowing does. It kills dialogue. It replaces mutual exploration with performance. You see it in leadership. A manager misunderstands a problem but feels too certain or too threatened to ask for clarification. So they issue a confident directive based on a flawed premise and watch the fallout unfold. Not because they're malicious, because they've tied their competence to being right. And when people equate being right with being safe, they stop taking in new information altogether.
You see it in parenting. A mother or father repeats a belief about discipline or emotion or success that they inherited without questioning. It worked for them, or it seemed to, so they pass it down, without ever really asking whether it still fits, whether the world their child is growing up in is the same as the one they came from. The assumption becomes the truth, the tradition becomes the rule, and the child becomes the casualty of something the parent never fully examined. These moments don't always look dramatic. Sometimes they're quiet, subtle, but they compound. They shape the emotional culture of a family, a workplace, a community. Because when people stop revising, everything around them starts to calcify. Curiosity becomes a threat. Disagreement becomes disrespect. Uncertainty becomes weakness. And in that kind of culture, nobody learns. They just double down. The most dangerous thing about confident ignorance is that it doesn't feel fragile. It feels strong. It feels sharp. It performs well. But it only works when nothing pushes back. The second something breaks through, a real crisis, a real contradiction, a real moment of not knowing, it starts to collapse. And when it does, the person behind it often panics, not because they were wrong, but because they never developed the internal flexibility to be wrong. That's why this isn't just about knowledge, it's about resilience. People who rely on false certainty don't just make bad arguments, they make bad decisions. They fight the wrong battles. They miss the real point. And when life inevitably gets complicated, and it always does, they're the ones who fall apart because they never built the psychological muscle to hold ambiguity, to navigate complexity, or to update their perspective without losing their identity. That's the cost. Not just being misinformed, but being unprepared for real life. Not just lacking insight, but lacking the internal structure to grow when it's needed most. Real understanding isn't something you stumble into, it's something you build. And the process of building it doesn't feel clean or efficient. It feels slow, awkward, frustrating. It requires the one thing most people now seem allergic to, staying with something long enough to actually metabolize it. Learning, in any meaningful sense, is not passive. You don't absorb depth by osmosis. You earn it by wrestling with ideas that don't immediately make sense, by asking questions that don't have tidy answers, by sitting in the discomfort of, I don't get this yet, without rushing to resolve it. That kind of cognitive endurance is becoming rare, not because we're incapable, but because we've stopped treating it as necessary.
There's a reason it feels harder to learn something when you're really doing it. Psychologists call this desirable difficulty. When learning feels hard, it usually means your brain is working to construct new pathways to integrate and reorganize information, not just recite it. It's like strength training for the mind, uncomfortable in the moment, but necessary for long-term resilience. You don't get stronger by watching someone else lift weights. And you don't get smarter by hearing someone else's opinion and repeating it louder. But we've replaced depth with fluency. We highlight things we never reflect on. We save things we never come back to. We listen to things we don't try to explain. These habits feel productive, but they leave no trace. They give us the illusion that we're building understanding, when what we're really building is a library of half-formed thoughts we never learned to use. The shift requires something simple, but deeply uncomfortable. Slowing down. Sitting with something. Asking yourself if you really understand it well enough to teach it to someone else. Not in a flashy way. Not in a clever way. Just in a way that shows you've earned it. Most people avoid that kind of reflection because it's humbling. It reveals the gap between what we think we know and what we've actually internalized. But that gap is where real learning begins. Metacognition, the ability to think about your own thinking, is one of the strongest predictors of deep understanding. It's not about having all the answers. It's about knowing where your knowledge ends, about being able to say, I'm confident up to this point, but beyond that, I'm still figuring it out. That's not weakness. That's structure. That's a person who can adapt, who can grow, who can handle being wrong without unraveling. We assume smart people know more, but the real marker of cognitive maturity isn't how much someone knows. It's how they handle what they don't know, whether they bulldoze through it with noise and certainty, or slow down and build, whether they protect their ego or pursue the truth. That's what real thinking looks like. It's not fast. It's not viral. It's not optimized for engagement. But it's the only kind of thinking that holds up
when life asks something hard of you, and it's the only kind that makes you stronger for having done it. If none of this sounds urgent to you, it should, because this isn't about abstract ideas, it's about whether your mind is structured well enough to carry the weight of real life. And if it's not, that will eventually become obvious, not in a classroom, not in a podcast, but in the middle of something real, when someone confronts you, when something breaks, when you're forced to think clearly and calmly, and you realize you can't, not because you're not capable, but because you never trained for it.
We are not living in a time that encourages depth. We're living in a time that rewards reaction, performance, and speed. So if you want to think clearly, if you want to understand instead of assume, if you want to become someone who doesn't fall apart the moment certainty gets challenged, you will have to choose differently. You will have to build self-discipline, not the kind that shows off, the kind that shows up, the kind that can sit with a thought, a feeling, or a person, without rushing to fix it, skip it, or explain it away. That starts by questioning the moments you feel most sure of yourself. By slowing down when your mind says, "I already know." By asking whether you've actually earned that confidence, or whether you're just repeating something that feels familiar. Because if your confidence is unearned, then it isn't strength. It's a liability. And when life eventually puts weight on it, it will buckle.
But the good news is this: you can rebuild. You can reclaim your attention. You can retrain your mind. And when you do, you'll start to see the difference between noise and knowledge, between reaction and reflection, between someone who knows what they're talking about and someone who's just performing the part. Confident ignorance is common, but it is not inevitable, and it does not have to be yours.
That wraps up this episode of The Psychology of Us with Professor R.J. Starr. Each conversation is a step toward greater understanding of ourselves, each other, and the forces that shape human behavior. Listeners are invited to continue the conversation by sharing their thoughts, questions, and topic suggestions at profrjstarr@outlook.com. Every message helps shape future episodes, ensuring the discussions remain relevant, thought-provoking, and meaningful. For those who find value in these explorations, subscribing and leaving a review is a great way to support the podcast and bring these insights to a wider audience. Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and keep exploring the psychology of us.